My name is George J. Kershaw. I was born September 28, 1931 in Bybee, Idaho. The home in those early years during the Depression, there was no hospitals for the mother to go and give birth, so I was born in a log house, two-room log house with a dirt roof, and Dr. Anderson delivered me. My mother's name is Josie Mabel Kinghorn Kershaw. My father is Charles Elmer Kershaw. My dad was born in St. Anthony, Idaho, and he was born to George Frederick Watkins Kershaw. He grew up almost as a lone child. In his family, there were 14 children born to that marriage. But in those early years, disease was rampant in some cases. In the case of my grandfather and grandmother, they had 8 children, ranging in ages from 18 down to 3 months. And diphtheria was a curse in those days, and diphtheria struck the home. And all 8 children were dead and buried within 18 days. And my grandmother, it was fierce on her. And 9 months later, she gave birth to another son, which died shortly after birth. And then she gave live birth to 3 children. That would be Isabel and Annie, and my father, he was the last one. But he was pretty spoiled because of the loss of the children. They pretty well gave him, and he was the only son then, and they gave him pretty much. So he kind of run the gamut there. And he played football for St. Anthony High School. And in those days, they didn't play high school to high school. They played sometimes junior college to high school. And so many times they played Rick's Academy, which now turned into Rick's College, and then from there to BYU, Idaho. He played against Marion G. Romney, one of the first presidency of the church. And he was a big bruiser, my dad said. And he played on the line, and he went to buck up against Marion G. Romney, and he pushed his back out of place. So my dad suffered with a bad back most of his life. I don't know how active in the church they were at that time. They lived out in the country, and it was hard for them to get around. But he married my mother in St. Anthony, and then they hitched up a team of 2 mules and a wagon, and they moved from St. Anthony down to Rigby, Idaho. And he then had the opportunity to rent a 40-acre farm in Bybee, which they called Bybee. It happened to be from a relative of my grandmother, and so he farmed that farm for a number of years with a team of mules. And they were married, and they grew up in their family together during the very deep depression of the 30s. So there wasn't very many children born during that period of time, and my mother and dad, their blood was not compatible, which we now, in today's world, we call an RH factor. They didn't understand RH factors in those days. And so my mother was able to carry 1 child, which was, they named Elmer Glenn, and he lived 6 weeks and died. She didn't want to adopt any children. She wanted her own family. And then my father's sister Annie had a child, and she passed away. and there was no place for the child, and so the family asked my mother and father to take him in. And his was Hiram Watkins Kershaw, and he was 10 years old when he come to live with him on the 40-acre farm there. The home was a log two-room log cabin, so to speak, and it did have a dirt roof. And so that's the way we grew up. And during those Depression years, it was one summer my mother and dad almost lived solely on radishes and cottage cheese that they made out of the milk. They would milk the cows, and then they had an old hand separator, which they would pour the milk into a bowl on top, and they would crank this separator, and the cream would come out one spout, the skim milk would come out the other. They would put the cream in a can by itself, and in the summertime they would put it down in the well underground to keep it cool so that it wouldn't. But they took the skim milk and made cottage cheese out of it, let it clabber, and then they made cottage cheese. That's what they lived on. My father was, he was one that had a great respect for the soil. In fact, I learned an awful lot and a lot of meaning as to what soil was. He felt like it was sacred, and he had to take care of it. And as he left every year, he wanted the soil to be in better condition than it was when he started in the spring. They didn't have the fertilizers in those days. The only fertilizer they had was cow manure and horse manure, but they put that on the ground. But he had a great respect for the soil, and he passed that on to me. And even today, I have a great respect for the soil that I have here on my property, and I try to make it productive and try to make it go. So that was one of the big things that I learned from my father. He was very much a disciplinarian, and if you didn't do things right, or you didn't do things like he thought, you got your britches spanked. And that's the way I grew up, with discipline, and very, very disciplined that way. But he was not active in the church. In fact, he smoked. And I could never picture my father with a cigarette in his face, but nevertheless, he did smoke, and he rolled his own in Bull Durham. They get at that time. He liked his beer. He liked iced tea. And I remember him drinking beer and iced tea. And when I got to be about 14 years old, they wanted me to go to church alone. I said, no, I'm going to stay home and be just like you. And that kind of shocked him, and he went and got his suit on, and we went to church. He became very active in the church, and he lived a very active church life from then on. He was very studious, and he studied the gospel to a great extent. He died when he was 88 years old. My mother was the second child of 13 children. So my history in families was very large families. They had 13 children, which she was the second born to that. And it was in a log house, but it was only about 2 rooms, and they would have to make beds on the floor for all of them and so forth. But as she grew up, she never did finish high school. She left school, and at the time they had what they call a seed company in St. Anthony. And in that seed company, the farmers would grow peas for seed. They would let them mature and dry, and then they would thrash them. And then they would take the seed that they got out of the field, and they hauled it in large bags. And then during the winter months, they would hire women to come in, and they would pour the seed out on a belt, and it would go past them, and they had to pick out all the deformed seed and all of that was not good, so that they could then sell that seed to the farmers. So that was what she was doing in St. Anthony. She was a very thin person. But my dad saw her, and he says when he saw her, he says, boy, that woman has got problems. Well, with the problems, he fell in love with her. And so they were married in St. Anthony. She grew up on a 40-acre farm in Bybee. And the girls, there was 7 girls and 8 girls and 5 boys. So in order to make a living on the farm, my grandfather had to go into town and work at a grain mill in there. So there was a lot of work on the farm that the girls had to do. They had to milk the cows, they had to go out on the farm, and they had to pick potatoes, they had to weed and everything that was wrong with the farm work. But then she went to St. Anthony, married my father, and then they moved back down. And it was right shortly after that they moved back down here, from St. Anthony down to Bybee, that they had the 40-acre farm rented to them, and thereon was the log house with a dirt roof. I refer to that because to me it was quite a deal. But my mother was always a very loving mother. She loved children. She would have liked to have had 8 or 10 or 12 children, about scared my dad to death for that many. But she had, as I spoke of earlier, she had the Rh factor blood. My dad's blood was on the negative, and hers was AB positive, so the 2 bloods were not compatible. And so as the baby would grow in the uterus, then the blood began to fight with one another between the mother and the baby. And it would eventually kill the fetus, and then the children were stillborn. She went along, and by some miraculous means, she was able to have 3 children, and the blood turned out different. Each one of the 3 of us has come with O negative blood, which was compatible with hers. And so within 6 years, she had 3 children. They all lived, and so that's the 3 of us. After that, she had at least 2 more. She tried 2 more times to have babies, and they were both stillborn. So she settled to have the 3 children plus my adopted brother. And all her life, she was in somewhat subjection to my father. And sometimes he didn't treat her as he should. And later on in years, then he realized what a great woman she was, and he regretted the years that he didn't treat her the way he should. She adored all of her grandchildren. She just dawdled over them because she wanted babies and that, and so she took out her love on her grandchildren, and she loved them, and they would come every Sunday, and our children would go up there and spend a week, and she'd give them anything they wanted. But that was the kind of a woman. She was always very active in the church. One of the last things I remember that she said was, she says, "I am not afraid to die because I have offended no one." And that's an amazing thing to be able to say. And it wasn't too long after that that she did pass away. So that's pretty much the life. She lived a hard life on the farm. As far as conveniences on the farm, when I remember when I was a small child, we moved on to the farm after he lost the farm up in the rental farm up in Bybee. Then he had the opportunity to rent a farm down in Louisville, Idaho. And so we moved down there, and when we moved on the farm there was no house. They moved an old 4-room schoolhouse for a home for us to live on. Our yard around our house was grain stubble, so it was right out just in the middle. But she used to do their washing on a scrub board in a tub of water. She finally got a machine. We had no power. There was no electricity, no telephone, and no central heat. We had to heat the house with a wood stove. And but she had a washing machine, an old Maytag washing machine that they bought, and it had a gasoline engine on it. She didn't have to go out and step on the pedal until the machine started, and then she would wash that way. We never had any inside toilet. We always went to the outhouse. Eventually, my 4 or 5 years later, my father bought the farm, and so that's. But she worked hard. I remember going out into the field with my mother, and what people wouldn't understand much today, but we bunched hay, we shocked grain, we picked potatoes. She was in there, and my sister was in there with it. I mean, that was just part of the life of a farmhand. Was everybody had to get in the field when it was time to do certain harvests and certain things. Why, that's where you were. You were out working. I'm now coming on 82 years of age, and over that span of 80 years, it's almost unimaginable the change that has taken place on this earth in that 80 years. I look at kids today, you know, and everybody, all kids have cell phones, or they all have iPads, or the communication is today is unbelievable. Sometimes I look at and I hear people complain out that the kids and young people moving up today, they've never really understood how to work. That's one of the big changes, the big things, the difference that I see is how much work I had to do. And of course, we lived on a farm, but as far back as soon as I was 8 or 9 years old, there was a lot of cases I took the place of a man out there. We had about 15 head of cows, and there was my father and my mother and my sister and I. We had to milk the cows twice a day, and that was 7 days a week. When you milked the cows, they didn't have a milking machine. You went, took a hold of the tits on the udder, and you squoze it out, and you milked the cows that way. But through most of my life and growing up, in the summertime, we were up at between 5 and 6 o'clock every morning, and we had to go out. The cows, we kept them in a pasture overnight. We had a saddle horse, and one of us climbed on the saddle horse. We had to go down to the pasture and drive the cows up, then milk them by hand, and after that we drove them back to the pasture. And then we had to be in the house and have our breakfast, and we tried to be ready to hit the fields and hit the work at 8 o'clock in the morning. We would work at noon until noon, and my mother would have a big meal for us at noon. Oh, I remember back the meals my mother used to cook, and they were just stupendous. They were so good. She could really cook, especially she'd cook chicken, she'd cook steak, roast beef, and always potatoes and gravy, and everything we wanted to eat, she always had for us. Then we got approximately a 1 hour rest, and then it was back to the field again. Up until 1945, we never had a tractor, so all of the work was done with horses. So part of that was we had to bring the horses in, and we had to harness them, feed them, get ready to go, and then we'd hook them up. At noon, we'd always bring the horses in and hook them, bring them in, and put them in the barn, and we would then have to feed them hay and some oats. So after the lunch, then it was back. We'd hook the horses up, back into the field again we'd go. And we would work till about 5:30. And then we would come in and unharness the horses, take them back out to the pasture, bring the cows in. Then we had to go through and we had to milk the cows and get that all taken care of. Back in the house by 8 o'clock, we had a meal at 8 o'clock. By 9 o'clock it was dark and we went to bed. There was a lot of times we had our fun, but you didn't have any television to sit down and watch. Sometimes we would listen to the radio and the Shadow Knows and Amos and Andy. We had those. But as far as kids is concerned, we would get together with kids in the neighborhood. And so, except when we were in harvest of some type of thing, or we were under extreme pressure to get certain crops in or this type of thing, my dad always give us some time right after lunch. We had a canal that run across the street from our house. We also had a canal that run through the back field. So for us boys, we always went to the canal in the back field. We stripped our clothes off to the nude. We went skinny dipping. We swam for about an hour in the canal. And that was our daytime. We'd get together. We had some boy friends that we had there, and they'd come down, or we'd go to their place and we'd swim for an hour or so. In the evenings, on Saturdays and so forth, we had to make our own recreation. We'd get together and play Run Sheepy Run, hide and seek. We had swings on the trees made out of rubber tires.
What was Run Sheepy Run?
Well, you had a can out that in the center of your play yard, and all the rest of them, one guy had to be it, and all of them would go out, and so the one that was the it guy, he would walk around and he'd holler and say, "Run, sheepy, run." And when the others figured they could get in, well, they would run towards the can. And they would either, if they got there first, they would jump over the can. If not, the guy that was it, he'd kick the can. And then he was no longer it, and the last guy in, then he was it. And then everybody'd go out, so.
It was sort of kick the can, but you just had a
Yeah.
name for it. A farm name for it.
Yeah, something like